Akosua stared at the photograph of her younger self with trembling hands, her face white with shock and terror. The image showed her at 20, radiant and hopeful, standing beside the man who had promised her forever but delivered only heartbreak. Now, 13 years later, her twin sons stood before her, holding evidence of the father they'd unknowingly robbed. The billionaire who could have saved them all along but never knew they existed. Welcome back to Luxurious Obsession Stories, gorgeous family. If part 1 left you sobbing, part 2 is about to absolutely destroy your soul. We're about to witness the most emotionally devastating family confrontation in history. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story is about to take the most shocking turn you've never seen coming. Drop a fi if you're ready to have your heart completely shattered. The silence in the tiny shack was suffocating. Akosua held the photograph with hands that shook like leaves in a storm, staring at her young, innocent face, smiling back at her from 13 years in the past. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "From his wallet," Kofi said, his voice hard with anger he was too young to carry. "From our father's wallet. You met him." "We robbed him," Kofi replied bluntly, watching his mother flinch as if he'd slapped her. "Oh God," Akosua breathed, pressing the photograph to her chest. "Oh God, what have you done?" "What you should have done 13 years ago," Kofi shot back. "We found him, Mama. David Asante, our father, the man who drives cars worth more than our entire neighborhood while his sons beg for coins to save their mother's life." Kwame moved closer to their mother, his gentle heart breaking at the pain in her eyes. "Mama," he said softly, "is it true? Is he really our father?" Akosua looked at her sons, her beautiful, desperate sons who had been forced to become men before they'd finished being children. Kofi stood rigid with rage, his young face twisted with an anger that should never exist in a 12-year-old. Kwame knelt beside her, his eyes full of confusion and hurt. "Yes," she whispered, "David Asante is your father. And he doesn't know about us?" "No. Because you never told him. Because I couldn't." "Couldn't?" Kofi exploded, his voice cracking with emotion. "You couldn't tell a man he had sons? You couldn't ask for help when we were starving? You couldn't reach out when you got sick? Kofi, please." "No." Kofi was pacing now, his small frame vibrating with fury. "Do you know what we saw today, Mama? Do you know how he lives?" Kwame tried to calm his brother. "Kofi, stop. He has a house like a palace. Cars that cost more than we'll see in our lifetime. He spends more on lunch than we spend on food for a month. And you let us live like this, like animals, because you were too proud to tell him." "It wasn't pride," Akosua said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was love." "Love?" Kofi laughed bitterly. "You call this love? Letting us watch you die? Making us steal to save you? That's your love?" The sound of his mother crying only fueled Kofi's rage. Every tear reminded him of the nights he'd listened to her cough up blood, the mornings he'd counted coins, knowing they'd never be enough, the shame of begging neighbors for help, while somewhere in the city their father lived like a king. "Tell us the story," Kwame said quietly, his voice cutting through Kofi's anger. "Tell us what really happened." Akosua wiped her eyes and struggled to sit up straighter. Outside, the sounds of evening in Jamestown continued. Children calling, women cooking, the distant sound of music from a radio. Normal life, while inside their shack, 13 years of secrets were finally spilling out. "I was 20, she began, her voice hollow with memory, working as a secretary at a small import company downtown. David was everything I'd never seen before. Confident, successful, kind. He treated me like I was precious." She looked at the photograph again, tracing her younger face with one finger. "For 6 months, it was like living in a dream. He took me to restaurants I'd only seen from the outside, bought me clothes I could never afford, made me feel like I was worth something more than the poor girl from Jamestown." "What happened?" Kwame asked gently. I got pregnant, she said simply. With you two. And that's when I learned the truth. What truth? Kofi demanded. That he was engaged to someone else. Had been the whole time we were together. A woman from his family's social class, approved by his parents, suitable for his future. The twins stared at their mother in stunned silence. He was going to marry someone else? Kwame whispered. 2 weeks after I told him I was pregnant. What did he say when you told him about us? Kofi asked. Akosua was quiet for a long moment, lost in a memory that still had the power to break her heart. I never told him. What do you mean you never told him? I found out about his engagement the same day I found out I was pregnant. I went to his office to share the good news, and I saw her there. Beautiful, educated, wearing clothes that cost more than I made in a year. I heard him talking to his assistant about wedding preparations. She closed her eyes, reliving the moment that had changed everything. I realized I was just a distraction, a temporary amusement. How could I tell him about you when he was planning a life with someone else? So you just disappeared? Kwame asked. I quit my job and left the city, came back to Jamestown and decided to raise you alone. But why didn't you tell him later? Kofi pressed. When we were born? When you got sick? When we needed help? Because I was protecting you. From what? From rejection. From being unwanted. From having a father who might see you as mistakes that ruined his perfect life. Kofi stared at his mother with a mixture of fury and disbelief. So instead, you gave us a father who didn't exist. You let us grow up thinking we weren't worth having a dad. You made that choice for us. I thought I was doing what was best. Best for who? For him? Because it sure wasn't best for us. 3 miles away in his penthouse office, David Asante sat behind his mahogany desk staring at his phone. He had called the police hours ago to report the theft, but something about the incident gnawed at him. 2 boys, young, desperate, coordinated. The way they had worked together reminded him of something, though he couldn't put his finger on what. But it was the missing photograph that really disturbed him. For 13 years, he had carried that picture of Akosua everywhere. It was the only piece of evidence that the best months of his life had actually happened. After she disappeared without explanation, he had searched for her everywhere. Hired private investigators, questioned mutual friends, even returned to her old neighborhood in Jamestown asking questions. Nothing. She had vanished like smoke. His engagement had ended 6 months later. How could he marry someone else when his heart belonged to a woman who had simply disappeared? His parents had been furious, his fiancé's family insulted, but David couldn't bring himself to care. Some loves, he had learned, leave scars that never heal. Sir? His assistant knocked on the door. The police are here. 2 officers entered, a tall, serious man in his 40s and a younger woman with intelligent eyes. Mr. Asante, the older officer said, we've reviewed the security footage from the street. We have clear images of the 2 boys who robbed you. David looked at the printed screenshots they handed him. 2 faces stared back at him, identical twins, maybe 11 or 12 years old, with wide eyes and desperate expressions. Something about their faces made his breath catch. They look familiar, he said slowly. Do you know them? No, I don't think so. But there's something. He studied the images more carefully. The shape of their faces, the way they held themselves, the stubborn set of their jaws. Have you checked the hospitals? David asked suddenly. Sir, these boys didn't steal for fun. Look at them. They're desperate. Check the hospitals. See if anyone matching their description has been asking about medical bills, medicine, treatment. The officers exchanged glances. That's actually a good idea. Start with the government hospitals, then the private ones. If someone they love is sick, they'll go wherever they can afford. After the police left, David stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. Somewhere out there were two boys who had been desperate enough to rob a stranger. Two boys who looked strangely familiar. Two boys who had stolen the only photograph of the woman he'd never stopped loving. Back in Jamestown, the twins had left their emotional mother to rest while they went to buy her medicine. The pharmacy was crowded with people who looked just like them. Tired, worried, counting coins, and hoping for miracles. "Next," the pharmacist called. Kofi stepped forward and handed over the prescription, along with enough money to cover it twice over. The pharmacist looked at the crisp bills in surprise. "Where did you boys get this kind of money?" "Someone helped us," Kwame said quickly. "Rich people don't usually help poor children," the man said suspiciously. "This one did," Kofi replied, meeting the man's gaze steadily. 20 minutes later, they walked out with a bag full of medicine that could save their mother's life. For the first time in months, they had hope. "We did it," Kwame said quietly as they walked home. "We saved her. But at what cost?" Kofi looked at his brother. "What do you mean?" "We're thieves now. We stole from our own father. Our father who abandoned us. Our father who doesn't even know we exist." They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. "Do you think we should tell him?" Kwame asked finally. "Tell him what?" "That we exist. That we're his sons." Kofi considered this. "Why would we do that?" "Because maybe Mama was wrong. Maybe he would want us. And maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd have us arrested for stealing from him. But maybe he'd help us. Maybe he'd take care of Mama. Maybe is not enough, Kwame. We can't risk it." But even as Kofi said the words, he wondered. Their father had looked not evil, not cruel, just rich and distant, and unaware that his sons were watching him from across the street. What would happen if David Asante knew the truth? The next morning, David's phone rang as he was reviewing quarterly reports. "Mr. Asante, this is Officer Mensah. We found something. About the boys?" "Yes, sir. We checked the hospitals like you suggested. Corlebu Teaching Hospital admitted a woman yesterday, severe liver infection, advanced stage. The attending physician said her twin sons paid for everything in cash. Large bills, more than enough to cover treatment." David's heart began to race. Twin sons. "About 12 years old, matching the description of your thieves." "What's the woman's name?" "Akosua. Akosua Mensah." The phone slipped from David's hand and clattered onto his desk. Akosua. After 13 years of searching, two desperate boys had led him back to the woman he'd never stopped loving. "Sir? Mr. Asante? Are you there?" David picked up the phone with shaking hands. "Which ward?" "Sir, we should probably handle this through official channels." "Which ward?" "Ward 7B, sir. But Mr. Asante, you should know. She's very sick. The doctors aren't sure she's going to make it." David was already grabbing his car keys. Kofi and Kwame sat in the hospital waiting area, watching nurses move efficiently between rooms. Their mother was sleeping, finally peaceful after the first dose of proper medicine in weeks. "The doctor says she'll get better," Kwame said quietly. "If we keep buying the medicine. We have enough money. For now." They had been at the hospital for 6 hours, taking turns sitting with their mother and waiting in the corridor. Neither wanted to leave her alone, afraid that if they looked away, she might slip away from them forever. "Boys," a nurse approached them. "Your mother is asking for you." They followed her back to the ward where Akosua lay connected to an IV drip. She looked better already, less pale, breathing easier. "My sons," she whispered as they sat beside her bed. "How do you feel, Mama?" Kwame asked. "Stronger. The medicine is helping." "You're going to get better," Kofi said firmly. "We won't let you die." Akosua reached for their hands. About yesterday. About what I told you. We understand, Mama, Kwame said quickly. No, you don't. You can't understand because you're children, and I ask you to carry burdens that should have been mine alone. She struggled to sit up higher in the bed. I need to tell you something else, about your father. What about him? Kofi asked, his voice guarded. He wasn't a bad man. Selfish, maybe. Immature, but not bad. When I knew him, he was kind and generous and engaged to someone else, Kofi interrupted. Yes, but I never gave him the chance to choose. I made the choice for him. What choice? Between his old life and a new one with us. Before either boy could respond, they heard a commotion in the corridor outside. Raised voices, someone arguing with the nurses. Sir, visiting hours are almost over. I don't care about visiting hours. I need to see her, now. The voice was deep, commanding, familiar. The twins looked at each other with wide eyes. That sounds like, Kwame began. The door to their mother's room burst open, and David Asante stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his expensive suit, but his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild with an emotion the boys couldn't identify. He looked around the room frantically until his gaze landed on the woman in the bed. Akosua, he breathed. Their mother's face went white. David. For a moment, nobody moved. David stared at Akosua as if she were a ghost. She stared back with a mixture of fear and longing that made the air in the room feel electric. Then, David's gaze shifted to the two boys sitting beside the bed, and his world shifted completely. He saw his own eyes staring back at him, his own stubborn chin, his own thick eyebrows, and the same way of tilting their heads when confused. "Oh my God," he whispered. "They're mine." The silence that followed David's words was deafening. The twins sat frozen, unsure whether to run or stay. Their mother closed her eyes as if she could make the moment disappear. David stood in the doorway, his mind reeling as 13 years of questions suddenly had answers. "How old are they?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. 12, Akosua whispered. 12 years and 3 months, or 12 years and 9 months. 3 months. David did the math quickly. They had been conceived during the last month they were together, just before everything fell apart. "You knew," he said, his voice growing stronger. "When you disappeared, you knew you were pregnant." "David, please." "You knew, and you said nothing. For 12 years, you let me wonder what happened to you. 12 years of thinking I had somehow hurt you, scared you away." He stepped into the room and both boys instinctively moved closer to their mother. 12 years of having sons I didn't know existed. "I thought I was protecting them," Akosua said weakly. "From what? From having a father? From having someone who could take care of them? From having a father who might not want them?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You decided that for me. You decided that for them. You took away my choice." Kofi stood up suddenly, his young face fierce with protective anger. "Don't you dare make her feel worse than she already does," he said, his voice shaking but determined. David looked at his son, and saw a courage that took his breath away. "You don't know what we've been through," Kofi continued. "You don't know what it's like to watch your mother cough up blood every night. You don't know what it's like to beg for medicine money while rich people like you drive past in cars that cost more than we'll see in our lifetime." "Rich people like me?" David repeated quietly. "Yes, rich people who have everything while we have nothing. Is that what you think I am?" "I know what you are. I saw you today. Fancy suit, expensive car, wallet full of money you don't even count. Living like a king while your sons." Kofi's voice broke, and suddenly he looked 12 years old again instead of like a man carrying the weight of the world. "While your sons steal to save their mother's life," he finished in a whisper. David felt something crack inside his chest. You're the boys who took my wallet." Both twins nodded, waiting for the explosion of anger. Instead, David sank into the chair beside the bed, his head in his hands. "You stole from your own father to save your mother's life," he said quietly. "My sons had to become thieves because I wasn't there." "You didn't know," Kwame said softly, speaking for the first time. "I should have known. I should have looked harder. I should have found you." "We didn't want to be found," Akosua said. David looked up at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "But they needed to be found, didn't they? They needed their father, and I failed them before I even knew they existed." He turned to look at the twins, his sons, really seeing them for the first time. "What are your names?" he asked. "Kofi," the fierce one said reluctantly. "Kwame," the gentle one added. "Kofi and Kwame," David repeated, as if tasting the words. "My sons." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Less hostile, more uncertain. "Why did you come here?" Akosua asked finally. "The police traced the theft to the hospital. When they told me twin boys had paid for their mother's treatment, when they said her name was Akosua," he shrugged helplessly. "I had to see if it was you. And now you know. Now I know I've missed 12 years of my children's lives. Now I know that while I was building a business empire, my sons were learning to survive on the streets. Now I know that the woman I loved was dying alone because she was too proud to ask for help." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the crowded hospital grounds where families like his struggled with problems that money could solve. "I have been searching for you for 13 years, he said without turning around. "Every year on your birthday, every Christmas, every time I passed a woman on the street who reminded me of you. I hired investigators. I offered rewards. I never stopped looking." David. "And all this time, you were here, struggling, sick, alone, with my children." He turned back to face them. "I could have helped. I could have been here. I could have been their father." "You can be their father now," Akosua said quietly. "Can I? After 12 years of absence? After they had to steal from me to save your life? What kind of father does that make me?" Kofi looked at this man, his father, and saw something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not rejection, but pain. Deep, genuine pain. "The kind who didn't know we existed," Kofi said slowly. David looked at his son, his brave, angry, desperate son, and felt his heart break and heal at the same time. "No," he said firmly, "the kind who should have tried harder to find you. The kind who should have known that the woman he loved wouldn't just disappear without a reason." He walked back to the bed and knelt beside it, looking at Akosua with eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't look harder. I'm sorry you felt like you had to do this alone. I'm sorry my sons had to become thieves because their father wasn't there to take care of them." Akosua began to cry again, but this time the tears felt different. "I'm sorry too," she whispered. "I'm sorry I took the choice away from you. I'm sorry I was too afraid to trust you with the truth." David reached out slowly and took her hand. "We both made mistakes," he said, "but we don't have to keep making them." He looked at Kofi and Kwame, who were watching this exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. "I know I can't undo 12 years of absence," he told them. "I know I can't erase the struggles you've faced or the things you've had to do to survive, but if you'll let me, if you'll give me a chance, I want to be your father. I want to take care of you and your mother. I want to try to make up for all the years I lost." The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Finally, Kwame spoke. "What about your other life? Your wife? Your family?" David smiled sadly. "I never married. I never could. My heart belonged to your mother, and when she disappeared, I never found anyone else who could fill that space." "So we wouldn't be breaking up a family?" Kofi asked. "You would be completing one." What followed was the strangest, most awkward, most hopeful conversation any of them had ever had. David learned that his sons were brilliant, that Kofi was fiercely protective and naturally gifted at mathematics, while Kwame was gentle and artistic with a talent for languages. He learned that they had been out of school for 2 years because of their mother's illness, that they had been supporting themselves and her through street trading and odd jobs, that they had never owned new clothes or eaten in a restaurant or owned a single book. The twins learned that their father owned successful import-export businesses across West Africa, that he lived in a house with more rooms than their entire neighborhood, that he had spent years wondering what had become of the woman he loved and never knowing he had children who needed him. Akosua learned that David had never stopped loving her, that he had ended his engagement rather than marry without love, that he had kept her photograph for 13 years as the only proof that their time together had been real. It wasn't easy. There were tears, recriminations, moments of anger and hurt that 13 years of separation had created. But there was also something else, a sense of family that none of them had experienced before. "What happens now?" Kwame asked as visiting hours were ending. "Now your mother gets better," David said firmly. "The doctors say she needs several weeks of treatment, but she's young and strong. She'll recover." "And after that?" David looked at Akosua, then at his sons. "After that, we figure out how to be a family, all of us, together." "Where would we live?" Kofi asked practically. "Wherever you want. I have a house in East Legon with plenty of room, but if you prefer to stay in Jamestown, we can renovate your place, make it bigger, more comfortable." "You would do that?" Akosua asked in surprise. "I would do anything for you, for all of you." As David prepared to leave that evening, Kofi stopped him at the door. "The money," he said, pulling out David's wallet. "We only took what we needed for Mama's medicine. The rest is still here." David looked at the wallet, then at his son. "Keep it," he said. "What?" "It's yours. Both of you. You're my sons. Everything I have is yours now." Kofi stared at the wallet in his hands. "But we stole from you. You saved your mother's life. That makes you heroes, not thieves." For the first time since this all began, Kofi smiled. Akosua stood in the kitchen of David's house in East Legon, preparing dinner and listening to the sounds of her family. In the living room, David was helping Kwame with his mathematics homework, while Kofi practiced piano, an instrument he had discovered he loved and had natural talent for. She was healthy now, completely recovered, with color in her cheeks and strength in her body that she hadn't felt in years. The doctors had called it miraculous, but she knew better. Love had healed her as much as medicine. The transition hadn't been easy. Learning to live as a family after 13 years of separation required patience, compromise, and forgiveness from everyone. There were still moments of awkwardness, still conversations about the past that were difficult to navigate. But there was also laughter in the house now. The twins were back in school, at the best private school in Accra, and thriving. Kofi had channeled his fierce protectiveness into academic achievement, while Kwame had blossomed socially and artistically. And David was learning to be a father, not just a provider, but a real parent who attended school events and helped with homework and listened to his sons talk about their days. He was learning that being a father wasn't about money or houses or cars. It was about being present, being available, being there when you were needed. "Mama," Kofi called from the living room. "Dinner smells amazing." "5 more minutes," she called back. She looked out the window at the garden where David had built a workshop for Kwame and a small studio for Kofi's piano. In the distance, she could see the lights of Accra beginning to twinkle as evening fell. 13 years ago, she had made a choice based on fear. She had chosen to protect her children from possible rejection by denying them the chance of acceptance. It had been the wrong choice, she knew now, but it had led to this moment. Standing in a kitchen full of the smells of home, listening to her family, finally complete. "Akosua," David appeared in the doorway. "The boys are asking if we can have a movie night tonight." She smiled at him. This man who had waited 13 years for love to come home. "What movie?" "Something about superheroes, I think." They want to see if ordinary people can become heroes when they need to. Akosua laughed. They already know the answer to that. David came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Yes, he said quietly. They do. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere in Jamestown, other families were struggling with the same challenges Akosua and her sons had faced. Somewhere else, other fathers were searching for loves they had lost. Other mothers were making impossible choices to protect their children. But in this house, in this kitchen, with this family that had been broken and lost and found again, there was peace. There was healing. There was love. And sometimes, that's enough to save the world. The end. Drop every crying emoji if this story absolutely destroyed you. This is why we tell these stories, gorgeous family, to remind us that love never really dies, that families can heal even after the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most beautiful endings. Smash that subscribe button if you want more stories that will completely wreck you emotionally. Hit that notification bell because we have more devastating family dramas coming that will leave you sobbing. Tell us in the comments, did this ending satisfy you? Are you Team David, Team Akosua, or Team Twins? What would you have done in this situation? And remember, gorgeous family, love always finds a way home. Always.